Syria. It's really struggling, trying to rebuild after decades of conflict. But just as peace seems like, within reach, this new threat emerges, right, in the coastal region. And what's really interesting is that it's coming from within. Like,
Yeah.
imagine, trying to build this new future, but, the shadows of the past are sort of lurking around every corner.
Yeah, that's exactly the situation unfolding right now.
Right.
We're seeing these coordinated attacks by former regime elements, and they're specifically targeting the new government. And it's happening, in a region that was, let's just say, very loyal to the old regime.
Right. We're going deep on this today with an Arabic language analysis.
Okay.
The title is
Hmm.
which translates to Syria after Assad, challenges of the transitional and security phase. And it's really offering like a unique perspective on what's happening like down there on the ground.
Absolutely. It's not just about these random acts of violence. These are calculated strikes, aimed at security patrols and military checkpoints. They're literally targeting these symbols, of the new government's authority.
It's like they're really trying to send a message, aren't they? Like, we're still here and we're not going away easily.
Precisely. And, that really raises a critical question. How deeply rooted is this resistance, right?
Yeah.
I mean, are we talking about, just these isolated pockets of discontent? Or is there a wider network, of support? Maybe even some, external backing?
Yeah. That's a chilling thought. But we need to remember that the Assad regime, it fell in December of 2024. And since then, like, the new government has been working really hard to stabilize the country. They even launched a program to, like, reintegrate former regime members into society.
Wow.
Thousands have participated.
That's huge.
So it really makes you wonder, like, what's driving these attacks, if the government is making all these efforts.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Because on the surface, it seems like a genuine attempt at reconciliation. But to understand these attacks, we need to sort of go deeper, right? We need to understand the coastal region's relationship with the Assad regime. Because this area wasn't just like a political stronghold. It was like an economic one, too.
That's right.
Key industries, lucrative trade routes, and like a very specific demographic makeup. All of this contributed to like this deep-seated loyalty to the old regime.
So it wasn't just about like blind allegiance, there were some tangible benefits to supporting Assad. And now that those benefits are gone, or at least like, in question, some people are pushing back against the new order.
Exactly. And that makes the government's response really intriguing.
Right.
Because they're not just, ignoring these attacks. They're actively deploying troops to the region. And they're making it absolutely clear that they will not tolerate, this challenge to their authority. It's a firm stance, no doubt, but is it, the right approach?
They can't just let these attacks continue. Right.
Of course not. But, a purely military response has its limitations.
Yeah.
It might, quell the immediate violence, but it doesn't address the underlying issues, right? The ones that are, fueling the unrest.
Okay.
And in fact, it could even backfire. Imagine like, a scenario where the crackdown actually pushes, more people in the coastal region towards these groups. So it's almost like, their ranks would swell, their support base increases, right? Comes like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
So you're saying a show of force might actually make the problem worse in the long run?
Potentially, yeah.
That's a tough position for the new government to be in. They're trying to, establish control. But a heavy-handed approach could, like, alienate the very people they're trying to win over.
It's a delicate balancing act. They need to, project strength, right? And deter further violence. But they also need to kind of leave the door open for dialogue and reconciliation. And they have to do all this while, the world is watching very closely.
The UN has already like expressed concern, right, over the potential for escalation, and I'm sure many countries are anxious about, the possibility of Syria backsliding into chaos.
Rightfully so, because instability in Syria, it has a ripple effect, right, throughout the entire region. It impacts everything, from refugee flows to the potential for extremist groups to sort of exploit the chaos. It's a situation with like global consequences, and the international community has, a vested interest in seeing this peaceful resolution.
So where do we go from here? Well, our analysis, it outlines 3 potential scenarios, right? A quick military resolution, a prolonged insurgency, or a negotiated settlement. It's a lot to unpack. So we'll break down each of these scenarios in detail in the next part of our deep dive. So we've been talking about, all these challenges, right, facing the new government in Syria, especially this unrest that's happening up in the coastal region. It's like the country's, haunted by its past in a way.
Yeah, that's a powerful way to put it. You really can't understand um, the present, right, without kind of grappling with Syria's history.
Mm.
The Assad family's grip on power, I mean, it lasted for decades. Bashar al-Assad, he took over from his father in 2000, right?
Mm.
And he inherited this system that was built on, authoritarianism, control.
And it's not like everyone was happy about it, right? Like even before, these recent attacks, there were signs that like, everything wasn't okay beneath the surface.
Exactly. I mean, the regime might have, projected this image of stability,
Hmm.
but underneath, there was this simmering discontent,
Hmm.
Political repression was rampant. Freedoms were curtailed. And, corruption it was just everywhere.
So even before, the Arab Spring uprisings, that swept through the region, there were already like cracks in the foundation.
Precisely. And the Arab Spring, with its calls for democracy and change, it acted as like a catalyst, right?
Right.
Exposing those cracks and widening them into like these huge fissures.
I remember those uprisings. It felt like the whole world was changing, right before our eyes. People in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, I mean, they were all rising up, right, against their rulers. There was this like, incredible sense of hope, like this belief that, anything was possible.
And that same spirit of defiance, it reached Syria, 2011. Protests erupted across the country, right? Echoing these demands for freedom, reform that we were seeing, throughout the region. But the Assad regime's response, I mean, it was anything but conciliatory.
Yeah, they weren't going to give up power that easily. They met those peaceful protests with brutal force.
Exactly. Instead of, choosing dialogue, reform, they chose violence, repression. And that decision, it proved to be a fatal miscalculation.
It's like they poured gasoline on a fire, right? What started as, peaceful demonstrations, I mean, it escalated, right, into armed rebellion. And the country, I mean, it descended into this brutal civil war. And that conflict would rage on for years, claiming countless lives.
And it wasn't just, this fight between the regime and the Syrian people. The conflict became this magnet for external actors, each with their own, agendas. You had Russia, Iran, Hezbollah, all supporting Assad. While the U.S., Turkey, various Gulf states, they backed certain rebel factions, it turned into this proxy war.
Yeah.
It was this geopolitical chess match, with the Syrian people caught in the crossfire.
It's just heartbreaking to think, about what the Syrian people had to endure. Millions displaced from their homes, forced to flee for their lives. Cities, I mean, reduced to rubble. An entire generation, scarred by this violence, by this loss.
It was a humanitarian catastrophe,
Yeah.
On an unimaginable scale. And for years, it seemed like, the conflict would just never end. The Assad regime, though weakened, they clung tenaciously to power.
So what finally led to their downfall? Like, how did this regime that had weathered so many storms, how did they finally crumble?
Well, it was a combination of factors. By 2024, the regime was just exhausted, its resources drained after, years of fighting. The economy was in ruins, inflation was rampant, basic necessities were just, scarce. And on top of that, they were still facing this determined opposition from within.
So they were fighting a war, on multiple fronts.
Yeah.
Against rebel groups, against this economic collapse, and against, growing discontent within their own ranks.
Exactly. And it was that discontent, within the military that ultimately proved to be, their undoing. A group of high-ranking officers, they sensed the regime's vulnerability, and they were just disillusioned with Assad's leadership, and so they staged a coup d'etat.
So it wasn't a popular uprising that toppled the regime, but a coup from within.
Well, it's not that simple. I mean, the coup leaders, they clearly anticipated a level of popular support, and they weren't wrong. When news of the coup broke, Syrians poured into the streets, not to defend Assad, but to celebrate his downfall.
So it was like this confluence of events, right? A weakened regime, a disgruntled military, and a population that was just desperate for change.
Precisely. And the coup leaders, they recognized this need for, this broad-based support. And so they moved quickly to establish this transitional government, promising this, new era of democracy and freedom. They even, initiated that reintegration program we were talking about earlier, welcoming back those who had served the previous regime.
And that brings us, right back to the current situation. The transition, I mean, it hasn't been easy. Old loyalties, they die hard, especially in a region that benefited, so much from the previous regime.
Right. The coastal region is like this microcosm of, the larger challenges facing Syria. It's a reminder that, regime change, it doesn't erase the past overnight. It's a process, this long and winding road with, plenty of obstacles along the way.
Okay, so we've explored, a lot of the complexities of Syria's past and how fragile the pieces, holding the present together. But now I think it's time to turn our attention to the future. What are some of the possible scenarios, that could unfold in this really critical period of transition?
Well, our analysis, lays out three distinct pathways, each with, its own set of challenges and opportunities, like we're standing at, a fork in the road. And the path that Syria takes, I mean, it's going to determine its fate for, for years to come.
So let's start with the scenario that probably appears, at first glance the most appealing. That would be, a swift military resolution, where the government takes this decisive action and quells the unrest in the coastal region and just establishes, full control.
Problem solved.
Right. Well, and it might seem that way, just looking at the surface, but, quick fix, it rarely addresses the deeper issues that are at play. Think of it like, treating the symptoms without addressing the underlying disease. Sure, you might feel better for a little while, but the problem is inevitably going to resurface.
So in this case, you're saying the disease is the simmering discontent, right, that we see in the coastal region, the resentment toward the new government, and maybe some lingering loyalty to the old regime. Exactly. And a purely military response. While it is necessary to, maintain order, it does risk kind of exacerbating those very sentiments. It could create this cycle of violence,
Yeah.
where each crackdown fuels further resistance, pushing more people into the arms of, of the groups that the government is trying to suppress.
Yeah, it's this classic dilemma. How do you assert authority without alienating the population you're trying to govern?
Precisely.
Yeah.
And that's why this scenario, while tempting in its simplicity, it really is fraught with risk. It's a gamble that could easily backfire, leading to, even further instability and jeopardizing the entire transition process.
Okay, so maybe a quick military victory, isn't the silver bullet that some might hope for. What about the opposite end of the spectrum? A prolonged insurgency. I gotta say, this is the scenario that keeps me up at night.
Yeah, I understand why. This scenario paints, a pretty grim picture. A descent into, you know, protracted guerrilla warfare with neither side really able to achieve this decisive victory. It's a recipe for just ongoing instability and disruption and suffering.
It's a bleak prospect, years, maybe even decades of violence and uncertainty. I mean,
Yeah.
it's hard to imagine how the country could, even begin to rebuild, to heal under those circumstances.
Absolutely. A prolonged insurgency would be, well, it would be devastating for Syria. It would drain resources, shatter infrastructure,
Yeah.
perpetuate this cycle of trauma that has already inflicted, so much pain on the Syrian people.
Not to mention the potential for the conflict to spill over Syria's borders,
Mhm.
and that would further destabilize an already volatile region.
Exactly. A prolonged insurgency would create a vacuum, an opportunity for extremist groups to kind of exploit the chaos and expand their influence. It's a nightmare scenario, not just for Syria, but for the entire international community.
Right. Okay, so if a quick military solution is risky and a prolonged insurgency is disastrous, what's the alternative?
Well, that brings us to the third and arguably the most challenging scenario, a negotiated settlement. This path, while arduous, I think it offers the most promising route to lasting peace.
But after years of such bitter conflict, can we realistically expect these opposing sides to sit down at a table and find some common ground?
It will be easy. It requires a willingness to compromise, to set aside past grievances, and to prioritize the needs of the Syrian people over personal or factional ambitions.
That sounds almost idealistic. But I suppose even the most intractable conflicts, I mean, they have to end eventually, through dialogue, through negotiation.
That's the hope. And there are precedents for this kind of transition. Think of South Africa's transition from apartheid or Northern Ireland's peace process. These were, long and difficult journeys, but ultimately they demonstrated the transformative power of dialogue and reconciliation.
So what would a negotiated settlement, I mean, what would that even look like in the Syrian context?
Well, it would have to involve a comprehensive approach, addressing both the political and security dimensions of the conflict. On the political front, you'd need to see meaningful, um, constitutional reforms, power sharing agreements, guarantees for, minority rights. It's about creating a system that is inclusive and representative and responsive to the needs of all Syrians.
It's a huge undertaking. It's essentially like rebuilding the entire political system from the ground up.
It is, but it's also an opportunity to address the root causes of the conflict,
Yeah.
to create a more just and equitable society, and to lay the foundation for a sustainable peace.
And on the security front, what would need to happen?
Well, you need to see disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration of former combatants.
Yeah.
This would require really careful planning, robust monitoring mechanisms, and a commitment from all parties to renounce violence and embrace these peaceful means of resolving disputes.
It sounds incredibly complex. Is there any reason to believe that this scenario, I mean, that it could actually work in Syria?
Well, it's certainly not guaranteed. It will require tremendous effort, political will, and a genuine commitment to peace from all sides.
And what about the role of the international community? Do they have a part to play in all of
Oh,
that?
absolutely. Their role is crucial. They can provide essential support, things like humanitarian aid, economic assistance, technical expertise, to help Syria navigate this difficult transition. They can also act as mediators, facilitators, and guarantors of the peace process.
So it sounds like this collective effort is needed, not just within Syria, but from the global community as well.
Exactly. The stakes are high. A failed transition in Syria, I mean, it would have repercussions, far beyond its borders. But a successful transition, a genuine move towards, peace and reconciliation, it would be a beacon of hope,
Yeah.
a testament to the power of human resilience and the possibility of building a better future, even in the aftermath of, profound suffering.
It's a powerful reminder that even amidst the darkness, there's always that glimmer of hope, and sometimes the most challenging path is the one that leads to the most enduring peace. Well, that's about all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into Syria's coastal challenge. It's a complex issue, but we hope this conversation has given you some valuable insights and maybe even encouraged you to, continue exploring this, crucial topic on your own.
Yeah, and remember, understanding the complexities is the first step towards, finding solutions. Stay informed, stay engaged, and stay hopeful.